Well, good morning, everyone. Yes. This is, I have to kind of find myself a role in here, in this very cozy audience. It would be so much better if we were in a smaller room around the table, probably. So there's a bit of contrast here between the format and the audience. We'll get there. So for those who don't know me, I am Colucci-Gray, and I'm the current president of the Scottish Educational Research Association. And this session was kindly invited by BERA. We have 4 members and colleagues in the association. It's Mark Priestley, Donald Gillies, George Head, and Stephen McKinney. And they all will give you a bit of an insight into the changing landscape of Scottish education. What are the opportunities? What are the tensions? What are the debates that we are currently facing? So taking the high road, contemporary developments in Scottish education and post-devolution Scotland. Now, as you will have worked out from my accent, I am not Scottish. And we are in a sort of international conference. So before we go into the detail of Scottish education, I would like to frame the session today within an international and a global context. Now, when we talk about globalization, we all sort of think we know what it means, and the in-flight magazine of every airline company gives us all the opportunities that are available to us in a global context. There are also other ways of looking at globalization. And for those who don't maybe know it, this year, on August 13th, we had the Earth Overshoot Day, and we started asking for more resources than Earth can provide. In 2010, it was on August 21st, meaning that the patterns of demands has accelerated. There are also other ways of looking at globalizations. People that were in Budapest just last week at the Easter conferences, that had a first-hand experience of what it means to be surrounded by citizens that can move and travel, and citizens that don't move and travel, citizens that can take full advantage of globalization, and other citizens that don't. So we are in a sort of landscape of full tensions. So we are asking the questions of what education does in this context, and particularly what happens at the more local levels, what happens in Scotland? Does Scotland need to contribute to this debate, or is it just Scottishness? And from what I can see in this room, perhaps some people would think it's only Scottishness. So there are alternative narratives of development. Drawing on Gustavo Esteva's work, we have the narrative economic growth, innovation and competition. We know this narrative very well and transpires at all levels in society. We find it also in education. We refer to it as technical rationality in education, but it's fairly widespread in all realms of inquiry and policy. There is also another narrative that we like to work with, and it's quite aspirational, and it is the narrative of equity, inclusion, and dialogue. George Head will tell us a little bit more about that aspect of education as it is being translated into Scottish education. And these narratives are present together, they are in competition, they are coexistent, and they form the basis of some of the tensions that we're currently experiencing throughout, actually, the globalized world. Now, so what about Scotland then? What is so distinctive? Well, certainly, given the type of geographics of the nation, we can call it a rural country. There are 3 large urban centres, but most of the territory in Scotland is covered by mountains, agricultural land, moorland. At the social and cultural level, well, some history from Scottish education tells us that it was the first literate nation in Europe, apparently, by the end of the 18th century. And from a cultural point of view, it's been described as an understated nation with a practical sense of the public and a strengthened sense of civil society. So it's a very interesting place here to look at the tensions between technical rationality and social inclusions. I mean, Scotland is also the country of the Enlightenment, but at the same time, it's also the country of the civic spirit. So we have this sort of two two sides that are going along together. And the recent analysis by Lingard and Seller really looked at the key role played by the school system, therefore the education system, in forming Scottish identity, Scottish values. So if you talk about contrasting narratives, then we are bound to find that the school system is the terrain for these debates to play out, for these contrasts and tensions to play out. It's a good place to look into Scottish education and more generally the developments in education. So just to give you a bit of background about Scottish educational policies at the current time, and we'll hear a bit more from the presentations. In post-devolution, so that's when the Scottish Government acquired the whole powers, we've had a significant range of policy developments. Really all kind of came one after the other. So it's an interesting, lively time, a lively period. So the Curriculum for Excellence first, that declared a significant change in the way in which teachers would become active players in the delivery of the curriculum, and also a curriculum that aspires to develop broader civic capabilities as well as cognitive and academic aspects. Donald's review of teacher education also took a fairly dramatic stance with regards to the importance that it places on teacher education and the possibilities that are there to work in partnerships across different institutions in Scotland and to develop teachers' professionalism in a more academically research-orientated way. McCormack review of teacher employment in Scotland looked at capacity in the teaching profession, raising the status of the teaching profession, and the Scottish National Framework for Inclusion again took a fairly deliberate stance towards the values that Scottish education seeks to promote. So as I said earlier, we find here that alternative narrative of inclusion somewhat finding its way through across the system. So, in fact, as we can see at the title of the presentation, Taking the High Road, meaning Scotland wants to sort of take a fairly distinctive place in the United Kingdom, but perhaps you could say perhaps in a global context as a whole. So the yes and the no of the referendum was quite an interesting time to sort of see people being engaged in such debates, which are very difficult because there's not such a clear-cut line between them. And indeed, Lingard and Seller in a paper in 2014 again looked at the discourses of policy. And they noticed that some of these interesting tensions whereby policy describes Scotland as a social democratic community, pointing to internal references, so the sort of civic spirit and the values and the aspirations. But there are also some external references to building Scotland as a strong player in the global economy. Scotland is still a member of the OECD. And therefore, there are tensions, yet again, with regards to the priorities that are placed upon teachers and schools. And the recent document by Nicola Sturgeon says it very clearly. The aim is to close the attainment gap completely. Its existence is more than just an economic and social challenge for us all, it is a moral challenge. Indeed, I would argue that it goes to the very heart of who we are and who we see ourselves as a country. So there's an interesting conflation here of aims and purposes, this sort of aspiration for a strong civic community and yet a narrowing of Scottish educational priorities to cognitive and attainment goals. So I will leave now the place to my colleagues that will give you a bit more details about what might be possible in this context. Mark? Okay, that should be you.
Okay. Right, I get stage fright here. It's quite interesting, really. It's very strange indeed. I was at Easter last week and I spoke to an audience of 70 people in a room the size of a postage stamp. It's very weird. Okay, I want to talk about the Scottish curriculum. I've deliberately called it the Scottish curriculum here rather than Curriculum for Excellence because I think one of the handicaps that Curriculum for Excellence has had is being called Curriculum for Excellence. I had a conversation last year with a senior member of Education Scotland who said that privately he thought that it had been a serious mistake to call it this because it set up certain expectations of the curriculum which have been very unhelpful. It is called Curriculum for Excellence, or more commonly known as CFE, and it is a good example, I think, of a curriculum which is emerging around the world. And Laura talked about tensions between different types of aspiration. Aspirations to improve the economic competitiveness of the country against aspirations to improve civic society and democratic participation. And I think that Curriculum for Excellence exemplifies many of these tensions. It is a good example, I think, of a hybrid curriculum which is emerging then, which, according to my colleague Jenny Reeves, is a combination of adult education discourses on the one hand and very technical rational discourses on the other. And what Dennis Lawton described in the 90s, I think, as the educational right stealing the clothes of the educational left. Having said that, it is an aspirational document, and I think that many academics and teachers in Scotland thoroughly welcomed the curriculum when it first emerged in 2004 on paper, and have been broadly supportive of it ever since. I'm often characterised as an opponent of the curriculum. I'm not. I'm very much in favour of the direction. I'm less in favour of some of the ways in which it's been implemented. Okay, so the new curriculum then. This is, I think, a hybrid model. It's a hybrid model in several ways, partly, as I said, because of the mixture of different discourses that make it up, but also because of the way in which the model has cherry-picked from different curriculum traditions. It has taken, for example, from the progressive process-type curriculum model advocated by people like Stenhouse and A.V. Kelly, but it's also taken a very almost hard outcomes model as well, although that's been softened somewhat over the previous 5 to 14 curriculum. What we've seen over the last 20 years, and Scotland is quite typical of this, is a shift from input regulation, in other words, the tight specification of content in the curriculum, to a more generic or output regulation model. And this is about something that basically is focusing very much on the centrality of the learner. This has been critiqued heavily by BERA, of course, where we're talking about very active forms of pedagogy and a view of teachers as facilitators rather than deliverers of knowledge. It's also, I think, interestingly, and this is one of the tensions here, is that it is articulated as both key competencies and accessible outcomes. So we've got the competencies which are enshrined in the 4 capacities, and I'll show you those in a minute. And then we've got layer upon layer of more tightly defined outcomes which specify in some detail, but not as much detail as some would like, what should be taught, what should be learnt. This is also about a modular type approach and ladders of qualification. So Scotland has maintained a sort of fairly traditional accreditation system, although it's moved away from exam-based assessment more towards school-based assessment. And we have seen a maintenance of, and in some cases I think even an increasing amount of output regulation, so pervasive regimes of accountability. Now Scotland is different to England in many ways in that it doesn't have the marketised approach. Scotland is a system which has comprehensive schools where there is no competition between schools apparently, and yet we still have performance data use which creates, I think, cultures of performativity, and that's done through the local authorities, it's done through the inspectorate. Okay, so let me say a little bit more about the structure of Curriculum for Excellence. This is what is known as the 4 capacities, and actually the headlines here, the slogans at the top, are not very useful. Walter Humes and I had a bit of a laugh working out whether it would mean anything if we changed the adjectives around a little bit. It doesn't really. But what's important here, I think, are these attributes and capabilities, because they do represent, I think, quite a decent attempt to specify the aims of education. And we've been using these in our work with schools. We've been getting teachers to work directly with these as a starting point, if you like, for developing an education system or an educational practice. That's at the front end. This is what the schools have been working with. We have, I think, around 400 or 500 outcomes. They're called experiences and outcomes. And they're distinctive in a couple of ways. One is that there has been an attempt to make them less prescriptive and less tightly specified than the previous 5 to 14 curriculum. But they share a lot in common, particularly the fact that these are hierarchical levels of outcomes. They're supposed to represent progression. It's difficult to see that progression at times. They specify some content in some cases, but not tightly. They also specify the experiences that the students are supposed to have. And I think this has been a major weakness. There was an intention to frame the curricular outcomes for teachers in language that young people would use, and this is what's emerged here. One of the problems, as I see it, is the fact that this creates an alternative starting point for curriculum development, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. Okay, so there is, I think, or there was, a definite intention in Curriculum for Excellence to create a curriculum which put the teacher back in charge. Okay, so there's a lot of very aspirational language in the early documents. This is from 2006, saying things like teachers will have greater scope and space for professional decisions about what and how they should teach. We hope that emerging ideas will stimulate wide-ranging discussion in classrooms and staff rooms across the country. It goes on to talk about that this is about professional dialogue. It's about teachers going back to first principles. So there is a really big expectation in Curriculum for Excellence that teachers will engage in school-based curriculum development and that they will work from the first principles of the curriculum. And this is one of the reasons why I think that I disagree with the implementation of the curriculum. It set up some fairly clear aims of education in the 4 capacities and then reframe those in the outcomes. And one of the things that we've seen in our research very clearly is a tendency for schools to take the outcomes and to audit existing practice against them rather than this connection with the big ideas, with the big principles of the curriculum. Okay, so has this worked? I think we can look at this on 2 levels. Things like the Donaldson report, which has talked about the need for the teacher to become an extended professional, really raise the stakes in terms of teaching. Teachers should be high-capacity individuals. They should be a master's profession. Teachers should have increased and enhanced professional knowledge, and they should make professional judgment. Okay, arguably at the moment this is a good policy because what we've seen in our research is actually some quite limited capacity in terms of curriculum development. So, for example, the research that we did in Highland Council in 2011 to 12 showed that many teachers had very limited understandings of the big ideas of the curriculum. We established fairly quickly, actually, in that research, that what had happened was that there'd been very little time and space for sense-making around these. People had just been told to get on with it. Okay, so what we're seeing here is also a gap between the curricular aims and intentions and the prevailing teacher thinking about the curriculum. And I'm put in mind of Pasi Salberg, who said that in Finland in the 1990s there was a systematic attempt to get teachers to develop a theory of knowledge, and I think that that hasn't happened in Scotland. So we've got a disjuncture between teachers who are largely transmissionist and didactic in their thinking about the curriculum. They talk about delivery of knowledge, and a curriculum which is arguably, although never explicitly, constructivist in its approach. We've also found in some of our more recent work that there is a very limited knowledge of some of the processes required and some of the principles that underpin school-based curriculum development. And we've seen very clearly in many schools the tendency for primary and secondary schools to audit practice against the outcomes rather than thinking about what constitutes fit-for-purpose practice against the big ideas. We've also seen, I think, and this came through very strongly in our teacher agency project, a limited educational discourse. And put simply, many of the teachers we talk to lack the educational language to critically engage with the ideas in policy. So what we tended to see is people adopting the new language of the curriculum, often to describe existing practices. And this doesn't, I think, provide a sound basis for transforming the way that people think about education and the way they enact practice in education. What was very evident in both these research projects was a very strong socialisation from the previous curriculum, particularly for primary school teachers, and many primary schools are trying to treat Curriculum for Excellence with its looser, more flexible outcomes in the same way as they've treated the old curriculum, which is basically about evidence in outcomes and seeing curriculum development in that sort of sense. We have seen some recent evidence this is shifting. A colleague of mine, Carolyn Wallace, who was over from the States recently, spent some time in 2 local authorities and found significant evidence of the development of cooperative learning and dialogical learning and constructivist science approaches, and saw a distinct contrast between this and the situation when she was last in Scotland 4 years ago. So I think we're seeing progress. It takes time, of course. One of the problems, I think, with policy in Scotland and elsewhere is that we tend to overemphasize the importance of teacher capacity. And we see discourses like the OECD's Teachers Matter, for example, or McKinney, talking about the fact that the teacher is the single most important factor. And clearly that is important. It's important that we have high capacity teachers. But one of the things I think that hasn't happened in Scotland is that we haven't seen an attempt to address system capacity. And there are a number of areas here, I think, where addressing system capacity, and I'm talking about the cultures and structures which surround teaching, which provide the context for teaching here, it hasn't been addressed in policy explicitly. So, for example, if we look at the original curriculum documents, there was a certain amnesia in respect of previous curriculum theory and previous curriculum models. It was almost like this had been made up by a group of people who picked from different places. And although very aspirational and well-intentioned and in many cases quite impressive, there were inbuilt tensions, particularly in terms of the different starting points for curriculum development that have been created. So this is, I think, as I said, a hybrid policy which creates these conflicting starting points. We also see this tension, ongoing tension between what the Dutch researchers, Kuipers and Berkgens, have called input and output regulation. Scotland had previously had a very tight input regulation, but not as tight as England with its national curriculum. And that's continued to a certain extent, albeit, I think, informally. This is systemic rather than in policy. So there has been a deliberate intention to reduce the amount of input regulation, to make the curriculum less specified, but we're still working in a system which is quite hierarchical, long chains of command through local authorities, for example. We're still working in a system where national guidance has tended to focus more on reinterpreting the original documents rather than providing guidance about how teachers should go about interpreting those for themselves. And in local authorities, we see a lot of interpretation of a curriculum. Some local authorities are actually quite prescriptive, saying that teachers should teach these particular packages and so on. So I think that the key message here is that macro-level policy has reduced input regulation, but systemic teachers have actually maintained it to a certain extent. Now, I think output regulation has been a more significant problem for Curriculum for Excellence because it's created barriers in terms of practicalities, what you can do, but also barriers in terms of perceptions. There is a perception of serious risk involved in certain types of innovation, which are encouraged by the curriculum, and people are simply saying, we can't afford to do that because it will affect exam results, for example. So we're still seeing in Scotland quite significant use of statistical attainment data, benchmarking, etc. And this is only going to get worse, I think, given the recent announcement from the First Minister that we're going back to standardised national testing. We've seen a mission creep in assessment. The outcomes, the experiences and outcomes of Curriculum for Excellence were originally stated not to be standards for assessment, but by about 2010, the documentation was actually describing them as standards for assessment. We still see inspections in Scotland, not as vicious as Ofsted, but nevertheless high-stakes events for schools with serious consequences. We see local authority audits as well, which often mirror the inspection process. And of course, I've mentioned these new national tests. So my view is that actually some of the systemic systems of Curriculum for Excellence are actively disabling teachers from implementing the curriculum, from enacting the curriculum in the way that's possibly intended by the early documents. This comes through in some of our research. So these are just a sample of some of the teacher voices from the research we've done, from the Highland research here. At the end of the day, a parent still wants to know exactly where their child is in language and maths. Are they on par with their peers? Are they below or above? And although we shouldn't be labelling children in these ways, there is still pressure to do so. And it doesn't just come from parents, it comes from the authorities as well, e.g. the standardised tests. Now, this was done 4 years before the standardised tests were introduced. In fact, the announcement by the First Minister a couple of weeks ago is in fact confirming, I think, a de facto situation where most local authorities are already using standardised tests. Okay, what we've seen as well is a lot of what might be called strategic or even cynical compliance with the curriculum. So this is a teacher from the Highland research saying, I can cover all of these assessment parts in with one project here, one short project. It's not exactly the way they're saying it, but you're not saying we can't do it this way. And it meets the criteria. I can tick the boxes quite confidently. And that is one thing you can see with Curriculum for Excellence. The rules aren't quite as strict, so you can tweak them without feeling too guilty. Okay? So we're seeing this strategic compliance in many cases, and I've seen this across now 3 projects. The other thing that really stuck out for me as well was the culture of Scottish schools. There is, I think, something that was called down under tall poppy syndrome. People do not want to put their heads above the parapet in case it's shot off. So this is a teacher, and we saw quite a few teachers saying things like this. You just do a good job. You try your best. You do not muck around. You do not do things you should not do or challenge superiors. Okay, so this is in a profession where teachers are supposed to be extended professionals, taking charge of the curriculum. And I think we have a way to go on that one. Okay, so in summary, and I'm going to wind up here and let my colleagues have a voice, I think that Curriculum for Excellence has been an excellent opportunity. My fear is it is an opportunity we've missed, and I think that we need to do far more to address the structural and cultural issues in the system which are impeding the development of the curriculum as it was first intended. Scotland's gone a long way in terms of developing teacher capacity. Donaldson Report has been quite significant in that respect, but I think we've got a long way to go in order to have a curriculum that's enacted as intended in 2004. Thank you.
Right, good morning. My short contribution here is on this particular, I suppose, interrelationship of research, the universities and education policy, and some issues that have arisen recently in Scotland. I think to begin here, I've just given an outline of what has become a very interesting political situation in Scotland. The top one here is parliamentary elections in Scotland, and the bottom one, the Scottish parliamentary elections. And as you can see, the election this year was particularly striking for what had been a fairly consistent pattern in Scotland since devolution, which was that at Westminster elections, Labour continued to be dominant, whereas in Holyrood, Labour had slipped and the SNP had come in, first of all, in a minority government and then a majority government from 2011. But the dramatic events of the last year, as you can see, have shifted that considerably. And polls taken last month, as you can see, are showing we have a Scottish Parliament election next May, and all the signs are of a continued SNP government. What I wanted to say in terms of education, though, that is quite interesting, is throughout this period of devolution, there was, in many senses, quite a consensus about school education and very little divergence of opinion. Curriculum for Excellence, for example, had all-party support and continued to have it throughout the period, with some minor issues at the edges. And generally speaking, in terms of school education, there was little divergence in terms of policy. Some recent attacks about standards of literacy in Scotland, and also there had been a continuing push from Conservative and reform groups about more diversity within schools. But generally speaking, what we've seen is an interesting consensus, largely over the last decade. So some of the distinctive features, I think, which remain, and I taught in England for a couple of years, that just came back 18 months ago, so I was very conscious of the, quite apart from the culture of education discourse, quite distinctive features, really. The first is that the Scottish system remains very uniform. About 96% of pupils go to state comprehensive. And even then, in fact, the data is not clear on the private sector, because many of the private boarding schools, as elsewhere in the UK, depend a lot on international students. So in terms of the actual Scottish youngsters attending state schools, the percentage is probably even higher. The other distinctive feature in terms of England is that we continue to stick with the university entry to teaching via the GTCS standards. So there's no school direct, there's no teach first, and obviously the issue of tuition fees is well known. I think, and particularly during the period when Mike Russell was the Cabinet Secretary for Education, there was a strong attempt to keep this consensus going through a tripartite approach. Government, teaching unions and COSLA, the Convention of Scottish Local Authorities, worked very much together as a group. Indeed, it was significant that when teacher professional update and continuing professional learning was being promoted, that Mike Russell was able to work with the unions so that the EIS, the largest union, for example, has learning reps who work to contribute to teacher professional learning. COSLA, the Convention of Scottish Local Authorities, has had some problems recently, and 4 local authorities of the 32, 4 Labour-led authorities have formed a subgroup. They split away. Whether that will continue or not is not certain. The largest local authority, Glasgow, has just changed its leader, and he's indicated he'd be open to discussion on this. Coming to issues about research and the role of the universities, I think there's been some developments which have been encouraging for universities and the role of research, particularly in teacher education. So the Donaldson report in 2010 spoke about or promoted this idea of inquiring professionals and the teachers' engagement with research as being an important part of their development. And although a master's level profession was not mandated, it was certainly indicated as the direction of travel that the government and that report was pushing, and therefore for a continued and increased role for universities. And there was an attempt to create a Scottish Masters to try and get the universities to work together, at least on a core of Masters provision for teachers, but that hasn't really transpired. There was some initial work done on it. The third point there, the push on professional update, it's now a requirement for teachers to demonstrate they have kept their knowledge, skills, and up to, they've been keeping them updated, and part of that has been an engagement or expected engagement with research, and the GTCS, the General Teaching Council, has now subscribed to EBSCO, so all teachers get access to journal articles and so on. And so that culture of research engagement is being encouraged. And then the creation, a couple of years back, of the Scottish College of Educational Leadership has now developed into a programme called Into Headship, which will be mandatory from 2017-18 for anyone wishing to be a head teacher in a Scottish school will require to have completed this master's level programme, and that is going to be run through the universities. So all of the universities currently in Scotland are working on developing their Into Headship programmes. So again, something I suppose those of us in the universities feeling as if we're valued and have a key role in teacher education. Some challenges, however, just to point out, there has been a feeling that the Scottish universities, in terms of their research capacity, have been downgraded, perhaps in terms of public, or I should say government engagement. The recent review of Curriculum for Excellence has gone outside to the OECD. They are currently undertaking a review. The review of early childhood went to Iram Siraj, albeit again in the university sector, but not within Scotland. Teaching Scotland's Future, which was the Donaldson report, the review, the evaluation of where that's got in the 4 years since the report, has gone to Ipsos Mori, just there in June or July. And as Laura mentioned in her final slide, big push on attainment, to narrow the attainment gap in Scotland, which is and a new investment, £100 million over 4 years, has been announced by the Scottish Government, but there's no role there, nor is it clear where research would fit into that. And I suppose there is a risk, as happened with the pupil premium in England, that people go off and do their own thing, and the research, the evidence base for the activity for these initiatives is not always clear, and certainly the outcomes not always as encouraging as you might think, given the financial investment. Interesting too, just as an aside, the Ipsos Mori, for example, gaining that contract to review the changes to teacher education, while they're having an online survey of 6,500 teachers, their engagement with teacher education institutes at the moment, ITE providers, is a single interview with each dean. So they're not getting to the level of those staff who are actually engaged in teaching the courses, who have designed them, changed them, the new placement system and so on. So it's indicative, I think, of where you get an external agency. It's not rooted in the system, perhaps being uncertain of exactly what the key issues may be. Just to illustrate some of this changing in research funding, I'm drawing on the work of my colleague Chris Holligan, who did some work using freedom of information to exactly determine where research contracts were going. Slightly dated now, as you can see, but I don't think there's been any shift since. You look back at the work first of Nisbet, who'd explored education research funding previously. And what's interesting, I think, is down at the bottom. If you look at the complete share, there was 73% of research funding went to the universities and colleges of education as they were then. And SCREE, the Scottish Council for Research and Education, had some 2, and that, of course, was abolished under the first devolved Liberal Labour Lib Dem coalition. Private agencies, only 14%. Looking at the spending from 2002 to 12, Holligan noticed quite a significant shift. Firstly, it was considerably reduced, the amount of money being spent on research, and the allocation of it, as you can see, increased involvement of third sector and private sector, and public quite limited. Apologies for the quality of this slide, but this one, it was just a snapshot of 6 months of research allocation. And as you can see, fairly paltry amounts of money for the university system. A lot going privately or to the third sector, and just small amount remaining for the universities. And I think that is probably still the case as typifying it. This was a speech recently from the Cabinet Secretary for Education in Scotland, and she was speaking about the Scottish Attainment Challenge, the large amounts of money being invested to try and narrow the attainment gap. But I think what was interesting is the outlook at the bottom, which I've underlined, and this is, I think, indicative of, well, it's indicative, I think, of politicians everywhere looking for quick, easy answers. They don't want the complexity that sometimes is involved in thorough educational research, simply easy answers that can be implemented quickly. It's also surprisingly similar to the language of Michael Gove when he kept talking about evidence and there being no place for dogma or ideology, which is rather odd coming from his perspective. But this idea that somehow there's factual information about what works in education and it's divorced from ideology or a particular outlook, I think is quite a strange, particularly from a politician who's obviously driven by political values, at least one could say that. So just to sum up before I hand over to George, I think there has been until now a consensus about education in Scotland. I think that is fracturing. The opposition parties have been quite effective, as I'll point out, in challenging the SNP government. There is a continued central role for universities, as I said, as sole providers in terms of ITE. Strong role now in teacher professional learning, professional update, and in the qualifications for headship. So the university sector remains strong in terms of education. As I mentioned, perception and some evidence that research funding is disappearing from the university system. Other issue, of course, local government austerity. The local authorities who previously had invested in teacher qualifications in CPL haven't got the capacity for that anymore, and it makes it quite difficult for us in university sectors to recruit onto our master's programmes. I mentioned, and Mark mentioned, the introduction of national tests, a proposal to have national tests, which could be seen as I suggest perhaps an overreaction to opposition attacks about the slipping, what appeared to be a slip in standards of literacy. But to introduce testing at primary 1, primary 4, primary 7 and S3, secondary 3, does seem to be quite an excessive response to what was to this attack. And finally, the what works rationality. I think we know it's a global thing, but I think we have to be, in the university sector, continue to resist the platitudes from politicians to provide simple, easy answers, silver bullets or not. So I shall stop there and hand over.
Good morning. What I want to do briefly this morning is really describe a response to the kind of complex situation that's been described this morning. And I want to talk about what we've called the framework for inclusion, and I want to talk about how in academia what we've done is take the values and beliefs and try to align them with the practices in schools. Historically, a little bit of background. Already, before the millennium, things with regard to what we call inclusion had been shifting and changing in Scotland already. In actual fact, one of my colleagues, Louise Hayward, in the late 1990s, wrote a chapter for Scottish education in which she posed the question, what are we calling ourselves today? Special educational needs, what are we calling ourselves today? Because already we were challenging the language, and the language is important here. Sometimes language and changes in language are just kind of linguistic piety, but I think at other times the change in language can signify significant shifts in thinking. And that's what has happened here. We'll talk particularly about the Additional Support for Learning Act in 2004, which changed the language away from the idea of special educational needs to additional support needs. Now, I find additional support needs still problematic, especially the two things about it, the fact that it's seen as additional, and also that focus on needs rather than rights while we're in a rights agenda. But nevertheless, it signified a shift in thinking away from individuals and individual deficit for which we had to compensate before young people with any kind of disability or learning difficulty or behavioural difficulty could be included within mainstream schools, towards a much more complementary approach where it was about thinking about the kind of support and provision that any young person would need in order to let them undertake schooling within the mainstream. But also within Scotland, I think it's significant to point out that there's been a wider overview and a shift away from education as a kind of isolated activity within local authorities. It used to be quite easy to find out where education was in any local authority because it was under education. But gradually, these things have shifted and changed, and you now find education under things like children and family services, for example. And that's a result of this move to much wider perspective that's signified by getting it right for every child, which is about children's and family services all working together in collaboration for our children. And so that entails education, health, social work, psychological services, and so on. So that's a bit of the background towards it. This is taken from a piece of research that I did myself. It was a larger piece on teachers' views on inclusion in Norway, Sweden, and Finland. And these are the same figures. I did a piece for Scotland, although I didn't use it for the publication. And these are teachers and student teachers' views on inclusion. And you can see there, by far, the biggest number was teachers and students, both teachers and students, who had some reservations, a small amount of reservations about inclusion. So largely, by and large, teachers and student teachers were in full support of it, but there's still this idea that many of them had some reservations about it. At the kind of either side of that, you could actually almost predict which teachers and student teachers were totally in support of inclusion. It tended to be, for example, among the students, it tended to be those who were going to be music teachers and those who were going to be RE teachers, that kind of thing. Whereas at the other end, it was perhaps those teachers whose subjects entailed the use of expensive or dangerous equipment, who tended to have the largest concerns about inclusion. But by and large, that was it. So that was the situation. So how do we respond to these situations? When, for example, research has been sidelined and money for universities is being sidelined. Well, the Scottish Educational Research Association has always had a way into Scottish government in Scotland historically. At one time, we used to meet twice a year with representatives from what was the Scottish office and then which became the Scottish government. Now that has changed as the situation has changed, but we still have contacts within Scottish government. They contact us, we invite them to our conference, so there are still contacts there and we still have some influence there. So there's, but we're not the only people who have influence. But as a result of SERA's influence and pressure on the Scottish Government to do something about it, but also influence from teachers' organisations and teachers' unions, and also some individuals, in particular the racing driver, Sir Jackie Stewart, who happens, wherever he lives in England, his back garden joins on to some influential politicians in the government at the time. And of course, Jackie Stewart is probably our best known person with dyslexia, who had an unfortunate and difficult experience at school. So all of these things put together, the Scottish government at the time decided, well, we better do something about it. And they approached this organisation called the Scottish Teacher Education Committee, which is basically, at that time, the universities still had faculties of education. They tend now to be schools of education. And at that time, the Scottish Teacher Education Committee consisted of the deans of the faculties of education. So they decided that what they would do is put together a working party from each of the teacher education institutions. And the short version of the story is that what we did as a group was we decided we would not do something for dyslexia because there was plenty of materials out there, but we suggested that what we would draw up would be this framework for inclusion. And both the Scottish Teacher Education Committee and the Scottish Government were content with that because we were able to demonstrate this idea that teachers were largely supportive but had reservations about inclusion, and that what they were telling us was that they required some support. And it was the same for teacher educators as well. Within our universities, within our teacher education institutes, there was felt a need to, we need something to help us address this issue of inclusion. We need to know what we mean by it. We need to know what it means for our teachers. So that was the purpose of the framework itself, and that's what we drew up. That was the initial one. It's been revised, as Laura said earlier, and that was what we produced. So, the beginning point, the starting point for this framework was not practice. It wasn't a practice based in the sense that here's how you do inclusion. There was a notion, a realization among us that you don't do inclusion, that it's not in your gift to include anyone in anything, but people need to be included. So it's a being word rather than a doing word. So it's based on a set of principles of social justice, inclusion itself, and of the current legislation. But more importantly, it's based on values and beliefs. The starting point was values and beliefs. Because how any person is included or feels included within a classroom or school or community depends on the actions of those other people that surround that community. And in the case of schools and classrooms, it's the teachers. And how they behave and react to young people is based on their values and beliefs. What they believe about themselves as teachers, what they believe about children and young people as learners, who's learning the value, and whether or not they value some people's learning more than others. So that this is just an example, a snapshot of the kind of things that we did. We took at the time the standards for registration from the Scottish Teacher, the GTCS. General Teaching Council of Scotland. So we took the standards for registration and we asked questions of these. So again, this was not a document to say, here's how you do this. This was a document that was asking questions, that was taking a critical approach to standards. And you can see examples there of how that worked. So that the standard for registration would say something like commitment to the principles of democracy, social justice, so on and so forth, respecting the rights of all learners, blah, 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 blah. And on your right, as you look at it, was the questions that we were asking. So why do some learners have different experiences of schools? What's making the difference? What about learners' identities? How are these constructed? And so on and so forth. So this was a document, a thinking document, as it were. So, did everything work out wonderfully? Did everything become right? Of course not, of course not. And there are issues that remain, enduring issues. For example, whilst this was intended as a document for use for teachers, but also for use for teacher educators, its use within our universities is variable. In some courses for initial teacher education, the framework's there, it's used fairly extensively. In others, it's not used in initial teacher education at all. It may be referred to, but is used mostly in master's level education. Its use in schools is, I have no, I only have anecdotal evidence for that. And as you might expect, it can be found in some of those schools where the teachers have been on courses at each of the universities where it has been used. The ideas of inclusion and social justice of themselves, of course, are contested and ongoing and dynamic. They are not ends, they are processes, they're things that are ongoing. And so, for example, in one of the things that's happening in Scotland across the universities, but mostly as a result of initiatives in Aberdeen University, is the idea of what we call inclusive pedagogy, where we've taken this idea of inclusion in education and it's been separated out into different aspects to consider. This is mostly the work of Lani Florian and her colleagues at Aberdeen, when she was at Aberdeen. And there's this idea that inclusive education is something that is understood differently in different cultures and in different contexts. And similarly, inclusive practice, what happens in schools, what happens in individual places is, again, contextualized in different contexts, even in schools within the same local authority. But inclusive pedagogy, that bit in the middle is what happens within classrooms, what teachers' values, what teachers' beliefs result in the practice that results from those. And that's the road that's being pursued in Scotland at the moment. And that, if you like, is the story of the framework for inclusion in Scotland as an example of how in academia we've responded to this constrained context and difficult context that we find ourselves in, and that's just something to do with it. Okay, hand over to Stephen. Thank you.
Good. Good morning, everybody. Nice to see you all. If this were a football game, I'd be the full-back, trying to cope with the loose balls. If it was a rock concert, I'd be top of the bill. But because it's BERA on the last morning after a good night, I'm here to keep you awake till you get to coffee time. I want to talk about some of the work that SERA, Scottish Educational Research Association, has been doing over the last couple of years. And in particular, I want to talk about our networks. George and Laura is the current president and George was the previous president, have really tried to reinvigorate our association. And one of the main aims is to ensure that we have a much more international dimension to what we do, that we're not just perceived as a small parochial group of people talking to each other. And we thought a couple of years ago that one of the best ways to ensure the international reach of SERA was through some networks. While they're locally based, we hope that they will have an international reach. So we encourage our members to form networks, but there are 4 main dimensions of a network that really are mandatory. You must have all these 4 elements. They must be interdisciplinary. They can't just be focused on one discipline. They must involve some kind of research component. Either the people involved are active researchers in this field, or it will lead to some kind of collaborative research in this field. They must also connect to the profession in some way, involve the professionals, and there must be a strong international dimension. So, it's about meeting with a wide range of stakeholders, and when I talk about the 2 networks that are live at the moment, I'll explain how that happens. We want to encourage in Scotland and more internationally a much wider awareness of a particular theme. The networks want to inform and influence debates, and we want to be a way of disseminating research findings. And we enable people to meet, to come together and collaborate. They must be led by members of SERA. They belong to SERA, and this is one of the things that we tend to emphasise. At the moment, they are not autonomous units. They belong to the association, and they work on behalf of the association and draw people together on behalf of the association. And because of that, they are accountable to the association. And so each network is asked to present some kind of event at the annual conference, whether it be a symposium, whether it be a paper, and they're also asked to have a network meeting and account for the meetings and activities throughout the year. At the moment there are plans for more. At the moment we have 2 major networks that are having a really serious impact on Scottish education at the moment, and probably even more so than we could have imagined. The first one is Leadership in School Education Network, and the second one is Poverty in Education. And the leadership in Scottish education comes at a very, very pertinent moment because, you know, we've heard about the Donaldson report, we've heard about the Scottish College for Educational Leadership, and this particular network is liaising with the College for Educational Leadership. One of the first events we had for this network, we invited the director of the college to come along and be the main speaker. And it's fascinating to watch as the college develops and emerges in the Scottish scene. The network is following along with the college. And you can see that the college has a commitment to innovative and quality leadership programs and services. I'm going to skip through this a wee bit for time. And also is looking for research-led, practice-focused and benchmarks internationally. Now, that link with SERA we think is really important. The link with our network is really important because the focus of a network must be around research and engagement with the profession. And so our network on leadership is to articulate and discuss leadership and leader learning and development, to connect academics, researchers, practitioners and policymakers. I think this is one of the strengths of our networks. It's a place for different people from different parts of Scottish education to come together and meet, to share ideas and to engage with each other. There are other ways in which this can take place, but in SERA we have a fantastic opportunity to focus in on the research, current research, and the research needs in a particular area. Also allows the leadership network to interact nationally, internationally, and of course they have got a strong interdisciplinary and interprofessional leadership role. Sorry. The second one is the one that I lead, which is Poverty and Education Network. Statistics change all the time. More than 1 in 5 children live in poverty in Scotland. We can start talking about absolute, relative poverty, severe poverty, but the Institute for Fiscal Studies predicts an increase of 100,000 by 2020. One of the questions that doesn't seem to be asked is what happened to those aspirations about end poverty by 2020? Where did that go? And also what happened to the Millennium Goals, which included something about child poverty as well. Just last week, this was produced by the union in Scotland, the Educational Institute of Scotland, and it's called Face Up to Child Poverty. It's hard not to get passionate about this, but I think this is a terrible indictment of Scottish society. This is frightening because it's guidelines on how schools can help children who are living in poverty negotiate the school day. One of the recommendations is that schools and teachers, where appropriate, should advise parents and children where the nearest food bank is. It's 2015 Scotland and so-called developed world. So we, in this network, are looking at national and international debates, not just national. It's not just about Scotland. Of course, poverty and education is an international debate. It's interdisciplinary. These are just a couple. It's to do with education, sociology. There's a huge gender issue here, especially if you go outside Scotland. One of our co-conveners is John McKendrick from Caledonian University, who is a major sociologist, but also a leading figure in Poverty Alliance in Scotland, and a really, really good person to have with us. Scotland and the UK, of course, low-income families, they're hugely problematic with the effects of limited resources, but worldwide, there's a huge impact on the education of children. And it's interesting, at BERA, you get the chance to hear people from different parts of the world talking about, for instance, the experience in West Indies, for example, the experience in Nigeria. Yesterday we heard about where many of the girls aren't able to go to school. There's also quite a big increase in interest from the policy and from the union and from various other people about this issue. We've got Scottish Government have released last year a strategy for child poverty. Going to be quite critical here. Several years ago, this actually fell off the government agenda, but it's reappeared on the agenda. I tracked it very carefully, went further and further down their aims, and suddenly it's reappeared, thankfully. But what happened for those few years it actually disappeared altogether. The Poverty Alliance do fantastic work, and they bring different groups together. And we've just said that EIS had a conference in 2013, and this document has actually come from that particular conference. And we've got some increasing amount of high-quality research on this particular topic in Scotland. Now, I've kind of tried to categorise it for you, and it's a bit porous. I can see Sue Ellis sitting there thinking I belong in about 3 of those categories. It's a bit porous, but trying to have a look at the ways in which the research community are looking at poverty and education. We've got Aspiration and Opportunity, work by John McKendrick, work by Alistair Wilson at Strathclyde. There's work on attainment, the impact of poverty and attainment, the impact of poverty and achievement. There's a whole issue about what we call new arrival children, not migrant children. In particular, Daniela Syme, who's been doing fantastic work on the integration of Roma children in Glasgow and other parts of the country. And then there's also, we're beginning to get some research emerging about the views of young people who are in situations of poverty and deprivation as they try to engage with the school system. And finally, just to give you a quick overview of the kinds of activities we've been involved in, we had a network event on the 16th of June in Stirling, and we were astonished by the uptake at this event, but more importantly for me, we had people speaking at the event from Poverty Alliance, from the Union, from the General Teaching Council of Scotland, from Education Scotland, from universities, colleges and schools, and I think this is where a SERA network really can be successful. It draws all these people together in a place where they can engage, where they can exchange ideas, and from that we're going to build a series of events where people can encounter each other. One of the very pleasing aspects is we do seem to have attracted many of the leading researchers and professionals in the country to join the network, even if it's just to keep an eye on what the network is doing. And we want to explore the key issues, and we want to really push a much stronger professional and researcher partnership in this area. There is good work being done, there's a lot of interest, but there's an awful lot of work still to be done. And that's me. Thank you.